Good evening, everybody. My name is Douglas Peers. I'm the Dean of Arts here at the University of Waterloo, and it's my great pleasure to be the moderator of tonight's discussion. I'd like to first of all start by acknowledging that we are living and working on the traditional territories of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is located on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Tonight, I'm delighted to see that we've got so many people coming out for us. Welcome particularly to the Math Circle for joining us tonight. One of the rare pleasures of being a Dean of Arts in Canada is when you can claim boasting rights. And one of the things I like doing when I'm meeting deans from across the country is pointing to events like these lectures and saying that we have very, very little difficulty here at Waterloo in getting out massive audiences for public lectures on fascinating topics. It's truly unique, and it's a credit to you, the audience, and the people of Waterloo that you're so engaged with us at the university that we can have these kinds of discussions. I've been associated with a number of other institutions, and it'd be very, very difficult to get this kind of turnout. So thank you so much for giving me those bragging rights. Tonight's lecture, it's part of the Bridges lecture series. The lecture series itself, Bridges, is intended to convey the very important dialogue that these lectures are intended to produce between various disciplines and faculties here at the University of Waterloo, particularly St. Jerome's University, the faculties of arts, math, and science. But also, I think the word bridge is also, as a metaphor, is also to convey, for those of you who are part of this community, the fact that we work very, very nicely across the various institutions. When I first came here to the University of Waterloo, everybody kept talking about the creek. I didn't know what they were referring to, and it's this body of water that over the last couple of days was actually quite large that lies between St. Jerome's and the University of Waterloo, and everybody keeps talking about the creek to me. But in fact, what's equally important are the fact there are bridges across that creek. And this lecture is one of those very important bridges that binds us together. Because as you read newspapers, as you watch the news, what you quickly come to realize is that the really wicked questions that we are trying to face in the world today cannot be explained by any single scholar or by any single discipline. They rely upon a dialogue and engaged discussion amongst people drawn from a very diverse range of scholarly interests. And tonight's lecture is testimony to that kind of spirit of bridging and dialogue. The title of tonight's talk is Beyond the Imitation Game, from Dieppe and James Bond to Blackberry and quantum encryption. I'm delighted to welcome our two speakers, and I'll say briefly words about both of them, and then I'll introduce them both to come up, do their presentations, and then we'll have a moderated Q&A section at the end, which I'm delighted to host. Our first speaker tonight is Peter Berg, who dreamt of being a scientist since the age of 10. I dreamt of being tall since the age of 10. He realized his ambitions. Sadly, I didn't. He studied physics in Germany before obtaining a PhD in mathematics from the UK. After academic appointments in Ontario and in Trondheim, Norway, he returned to Canada in 2015 to take up a position as Professor of Mathematics and Physics and Chair of the Department of Science at the University of Alberta. While he enjoys his research on fuel cells, his true passion lies in public outreach, hence his presentation tonight, and the Enigma machine is his favorite topic. And for those of you who haven't noticed yet, we do have a real one up here for those of you who might want to have a glance at it later. And our second speaker is David O'Keefe, an award-winning historian and professor from Marianopolis College in Montreal, and a best-selling author that some of you no doubt will recognize from his role on a variety of television shows relating to history. He's passionately committed to public outreach, in his case, public history. And tonight, he'll be speaking on the subjects covered in his most recent book on Dieppe. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers. First of all, Peter, who is also taller than me, which I'm okay with. And then followed by David O'Keefe, who's even more taller than me. So it's a fun night for me. Thank you.
How does one communicate securely on a global scale? You can try to send a letter, or a messenger, but this can be intercepted. That's a really old problem to solve. So one thing you can do is you can send a message that you somehow encrypt. You can then send this all across the planet. Anyone can listen to this message in principle. But what you do is you use some sort of algorithm. In modern days, we call this often a key, a public key. And you encrypt your message, you send it to your ally. Along the way, others can listen to it. But only your ally has the other key, if you like. It could be a different key to then make sense of this ciphertext, as we call this. And this is still how it works to this day. And this sort of method, whatever you try, is not 100% secure. You can, in principle, always break this message or break the code, but you need enormous computing power for it these days. So that's still the concept of modern encryption technologies. And that's also the concept of the Enigma machine, and I walk you through it tonight and how it worked in all detail. What is different and what has been done at Waterloo, if you moved on and use quantum encryption to communicate, that is inherently different in a sense that you can tell whether someone is listening on it. That's very different. Okay? So let me walk you through the technology part of the Enigma machine. We have one over here. It's called the M4. And I explain this in some great detail now. It was invented actually last Friday, 100 years ago. Okay. By Arthur Scherbius. And initially it was meant to be used for commercial purposes. It was at the end of World War I. So Arthur Scherbius was aware of the challenge of communicating securely within the German army. And so he was one of several people, actually, who came up with an idea how to communicate more securely. Out of it came the Enigma machine. What you see in the background there, that's the actual patent, right? So it says Patentschrift. I always say only the Germans could come up with that. I mean, you could just give it a single number for a patent, but no, look at all this, right? That's so German. That is so German. I'm one of them. Anyways, that's what he did, and the German military used it already in the 1920s and 1930s before Hitler seized power. That's important to appreciate. It's not Hitler's machine, if you like, but yes, it was used mostly and for evil purposes by Adolf Hitler. What it does, it encrypts and decrypts messages, and then once you have encrypted the message, you send this out with Morse code and radio waves. So by definition, anyone can listen to it, right? Anyone get that Morse code. But only your ally, that's the idea anyways, can make sense of it. And you should keep in mind this was happening, so during war times, this was also the early days of the modern computer. So it sort of coincides with that time, and you could argue it gave a big boost to the development of a modern computing technology, actually. There's the logo. Now, what does it look like? Well, we have it here. And before you look at it, after this talk, in more detail, you'll have the opportunity, I'm sure. Let me show you some photos. Okay, so there is actually the machine. That's not the machine on display. That's the one I used in Norway when I went on tour, if you like. That's on my kitchen table. It looks a bit like a typewriter. Okay? If you look at the display, up there, these four rotors, you sort of see this sort of thing. There will be 4 letters anyways. That will be very important in what follows. If you look closely, you can open up the machine. It may look somewhat like this if you have 4 rotors. This is what these things are called, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 rotors. They're rotors because they rotate as you type your message out. And if you take a rotor apart, well, you know, there's a bunch of wires in there, and I come to that in a moment, okay? And you have a set of rotors. And the set of rotors was increased during the war. They started with 3 rotors, and then 4 and 5, and eventually was, I think, 9. But in any event, each rotor is very unique in its wiring, if you like. Very important. Okay. The rotors are in touch with one another electrically. At the end of the day, it's an electromechanical machine. And as you type up the message, you will see soon lights flash up. Okay, so let me take you through the logistics. here's a schematic of what it looks like of a 3-rotor machine. So in the early days, the Germans used 3 rotors inside the machine. Later on, 4. And here's a schematic of 3 rotors. And I will explain to you now, if you typed out a message, how this actually works. So the main idea is this: if you type out a message, you encrypt the message, every letter of the message gets mapped onto another letter in the alphabet, but it cannot be the same letter. So you have another 25 choices, right? There are no numbers, by the way. Numbers were typed out. So the German eins, 1, you type E-I-N-S. Okay. Also likely, you're then more likely to give the right coordinates. Imagine you want to give someone the coordinate where to go with a ship, let's say, and you hit 2 instead of 1 on the keyboard. Well, it might be 100 miles off. Makes sense? So you type it out. That's more secure. So there are many combinations in which you can set the machine. I'll come back to it in a moment. And like I said, and as you will see, if you do the same in reverse, you get back the original message. So here we are. Let's say we start off the message with the word hello. So the first thing we type on this machine is the letter H. So on the Tastatur, I stuck to the German nomenclature, you punch H. That means keyboard, Tastatur, by the way. Okay? And then the current that flows, really, literally current, electric current, it goes over to what's called the plug board, Steckerbrett. German Steckerbrett, plug board. And on the plug board, what happens there is that each letter in the alphabet can in principle be wired to another letter in the alphabet. You don't have to do it, but you can. Okay, so in this case, let's say H is hardwired with A. So far, so good. Then you send the current up to what's called Eintrittswalze, entrance rotor or something, entry rotor. And the current just goes in, and then it is electrically connected to the first rotor that can actually move. So this is fixed here, that's fixed. And these 3 guys, they rotate. And again, at the end, it's a Umkehrwalze, UKW. That's the rotor that sends the current way back to the other side again. So anyways, there's electrical contact, and then inside, remember that wiring inside I showed you? The current is being somewhat diverted by wires within this rotor to another electrical contact on the other side. Make sense? That then is in touch with the next rotor. And you see how this works, right? And since this wiring inside, so 26 contacts on the right and 26 contacts on the left are all connected, right? In some ways. The current will somehow flow through this in some fashion, right? Okay, and it eventually will come back all the way to the left. It's being sort of diverted, if you like. Umkehr in German means actually diversion or return. Okay, and then the current flows back in some, it appears to be random fashion. It's not really random. If you know the wiring, it's not random, right? But what happens is the current comes down back to the Steckerbrett. What is it? T. Mapped to D, let's say it's connected to D, and then finally it makes its way to the Lampenfeld, so to the lamps that can light up, an area of lamps. And finally, after all this, D shows up. Now you write down D. My goodness, after all this, you want to punch in hello, and now you got H mapped onto D. So far, so good? Each time you punch a letter, this rotor moves by 1 over 26 times 360 degrees, by 1 notch, if you like. Make sense? So that means all the electrical contacts between this rotor and this rotor change. Okay? While this guy turns around, if it punched 26 times, right, a message with 26 characters, then this will have turned once, correct? In the process, at some point, it takes this one with it by 1 notch. You see what I mean? And then when this guy turns 26 times, it takes this one at some point once with it. So after 26 times 26 times 26, you figure that out, 15,000, I don't know what it is. You have the old setting you started with. Make sense? But you're not going to type out 15,000, a message with 15,000 characters, the war's over. Right? That's too long. There's a limit, in fact, it was 250. It's a bit like modern technology, I was told. So that is the principle. Okay, so far so good. So what do we need to know here now? So if you want to encrypt the message letter by letter, you need to know the following now. You have to select the wheels out of a wheel set of 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever wheels at that time in history. And you had to put the wheels in a certain order, right? That's called the wheel order. So that already gave you a bunch of combinations yet, that you could utilize. Then the plug board I showed you, I told you every letter, say you pick the first letter, you can hardwire with any on the other 25. Then you have 24 left, correct? You can wire with one of the other 23. You get that? Gives you God knows how many trillions of combinations. Right. Ring setting. So I told you if you look at the machine in this display, you have four, in this case, 4 letters to look at. With the 3 rotors, there are 3 letters you look through see this display on top of the machine. So that ring of 26 characters, you can rotate relatively to the inner wiring. That's a ring setting. You can do this for all the rotors, right? And then finally, we're going to do this in a moment, you start off encrypting the machine with, when that's all done, you still have to decide which letter shows face up for the left rotor, center, and right rotor. Make sense? Lots of combinations. There you go. I got myself something like 10 to the 26 or settings of the machine that you can encrypt something with. You see different numbers, but they're all of this order of magnitude. It also depends if you have a 3-rotor machine, a 4-rotor machine, and how many wheels you have, etc. Anyways, I always say it's roughly, it's an Avogadro constant for the scientists here sort of thing. It's a huge number. Like, atoms in your body, not quite, but, sort of, and stars in the universe, visible universe, gives you some idea how many combinations. The Nazis thought, this is safe, this is secure, because there's an extraordinary number of potential settings. The last Enigma message was actually cracked in 2013 with distributed computing power in Germany. Turned out, no one knew what the message was, turned out it was completely irrelevant. But it was a challenge, right? So sometimes you get the question, Peter, can I crack that kind of stuff these days on my laptop? In principle, no. Or you wait a long time, depends how long you want to run the laptop. But it depends, right? So, you can be lucky and maybe get to it earlier, but maybe not. So it's formidable to this day, actually. Now, the last thing then you have is, we have to decide, remember when we encrypt the text, where we start off. And that's called individual message setting. CAD, if you have 3 rotors or 4 rotors, it could be something else, would be an example. So the German Army and Air Force, until May 1940, made a formidable mistake, and I'll show you that in a moment. They had to choose 3 letters. If I send a message to one of you in the audience with the Enigma, I also have to tell you, all these settings I told you about so far are given by central command, essentially, for the given day. It's in a code book. And then me, as the sender of an individual message, can then still decide what the 3 or 4 letters, depending what machine, shows right through the windows as I start typing the message. Okay. And let's say it's a 3-rotor machine, so I have to tell you what the 3 letters are that I start with. And what the Germans thought was, let's encrypt this twice, to be safe, and then we send this across, and that should work. Turns out it was a huge mistake. Later, and then for the Navy, that's Enigma, it was harder to break the code for many reasons. One reason was that the Battle of the Atlantic was considered absolutely crucial to win for the Nazis, and not being able to break the naval Enigma, therefore, would make sense. So there is a little, they introduced what's called bigram tables. It's a more complex way of me telling you what my initial setting is, to keep it very simple, okay? It was really difficult to break it, though. Alan Turing and his colleagues managed to do it, right? But on an ongoing basis, even they struggled at times to crack it. And I throw this up here. If you even can't read, I read it out to you. You're going to love it. Doppelbuchstaben-Austauschtafeln. Double letter exchange tables. It's one word in German, of course. That's the kind of code book you carried around for the next few months, which they told you what kind of bigram tables to use. So let's actually do a demonstration. So if maybe Benoit can come up, and we have a little simulation how this really worked. Okay. So this is a program. That's fine. If it comes up. There it is. Enigma means riddle in Greek, just to let you know that looked like one to me. So here we go. So now we're going to do, we send actually the message now. Benoit and then Paul will decrypt. There it is. It's a 3-rotor Enigma. To save a bit of time, what I did already before the talk, I set this machine up for the day with a central setting, say, that came from Berlin, let's say. Okay, so what that means is, if I open this up, this is a program you can download off the internet. If I open up the machine, it sort of looks like this. And what it says here, this is the Umkehrwalze, the return rotor. It says Kriegsmarine, right? That's the Navy. M3, there's 3 rotors. UKW, Umkehrwalze, that's a particular type of reflector, I guess you call it. And then it's type B. Okay, so as you can see down, I can choose a number of wheels inside. I have to pick 3 wheels, right? So I picked wheel 7, 2, and 5. On the day I was given that information, right, from central command, if you like. Okay, and then if I pick a wheel, let's say this, if I click on it, this is the side view of the wheel, and these are 26 contacts, you see. And down here, this H08 is the ring setting, which I can change by clicking on it here. So that means the position of the internal wires relative to the 26 letters around the wheel. Okay, and let's slide this back. So these are the wheels I had to choose for the day. Okay, they're given to me. Let me close that again. And then remember, the other thing we have to do is all these plug board connections. There they are. So that's the front view. Actually, you can see it really nicely there if you're close enough. I was told today, on this day, I have to connect 1, which represents letter A, okay, with, what is it, with 22. And then, 3, which is C, with 17. And you get the gist of it, right? Okay. So I'm not utilizing all the plug board connections. And in the early days of the war, the Germans didn't. They only connected very few. And it was easier to crack the machine, if you like, the code or the message. The more connections you make here, the harder it gets. Okay, here we are. So now one last piece of information before you start. So central command also tells me today I have to choose. By the way, that's the actual sound that the machine makes as you type. Very mechanical, right? So they told me today I have to use the central setting, X, Y, Z. It could be anything, okay? It could be W, O, N, I don't know, whatever. And Benoit now wants to finally send this message. You want to send the message using ABC as your initial setting, okay, of the message. So now you punch into this twice, ABC, just on this keyboard. ABC twice. All right, do it again. Yeah, very good. So you saw probably the lamps, kind of lights flash. What happened was down here, it shows you what came out of the wash. So ABC, it's pretty small, but ABC was punched in twice, and it was mapped onto Z, Q, K, S, R, M. So far, so good? I write this down. So we're the operators of this thing. I write down these 6 letters. All right, so far, so good. Now, we choose ABC. Okay, here we go. ABC. Right. Now you punch in, this is the setting we agreed on, right? You encrypt it twice.
I agree.
Good. Now you punch in this message, including the X in between.
Louder.
So hang on. Yeah, right. No, you don't.
Okay, Paul will have to find out what the message is.
That's right. So while you do that, so words were separated with an X in German. X is not very common in X is not very common in the German language. We don't say X-ray, for instance. We say Röntgenstrahlung, things like that. And there's umlaut in German, the Ö, you know, that funny business. Actually, I've seen it today in town. Waterloo really has a German heritage. Typically, it typed it out with a UE is Ü, right? You get that? OE is Ö, and so on. All these things. And we have, as you see on the keyboard, we have no numbers. Thank you.
Am I dismissed?
You are dismissed. So now what happens is, I wrote this down. This is the radio wave. Okay, here it is. This piece of paper is a radio wave. And while this goes around, Paul comes up. All right, here we go. So this thing goes around across the world, really, or the Atlantic, or like, all of Europe, whatever. This thing goes around. Any one of you can intercept this, of course. So does Paul. And I'm with Paul now, and we did the same thing. We have the same settings. We haven't changed the rotors and wiring and nothing. Okay. So what we have to do, first of all, we have to find out the initial setting that he used, the 3 letters that he used, from the 6 encrypted characters. Okay, well, let's do this. Okay, so we have to choose X, Y, Z. All right. There you go. X, Y, Z. Right. So now, here we go. If you punch in these 6 letters there, Z, right. Let's see what we get. Right. Hallelujah. ABC, ABC. Ha! Here's the thing. Now you can have confidence, right? ABC twice. That's got to be the setting. Here's the big mistake. You know that the first letter that was encrypted is the same as the 4th letter. The second the same as the 5th. The third the same as the 6th. You have a correlation amongst the encrypted signal and characters. Aha. That's how you broke the machine. The Poles did for many years. Germans thought, let's make double sure, you know? Made a big mistake. So let's actually set it to ABC now. All right. Okay, the other way. I always forget which way it is. I would have been useless. So there you go. Okay. This whole thing in brackets there. Actually, or this one if you like. Same thing. Yeah. This space ignore. Just those. Keep as if there was no space. Yeah. Let's keep going. Let's see if you got that right.
That's not easy to type.
I think so. Can you read this out? The X is just a space in between.
Anyone?
Right. Yeah. Right. Very good. Yeah, let's switch back to the presentation. So you see how this kind of works, right? Now, you can also imagine if you do this several times a day, several months in a row, maybe a few years as an operator daily, you will get very lazy. You're not going to think of these 3 or 4 letters for the initial setting each time. You're going to take shortcuts, right? Take the same again, or something trivial, something you remember all the time, or take the one from the previous message. You kind of get it, right? That's what the Germans did, luckily, if you like, in Bletchley Park. Here's a code book. I love this. This is from Kingston, Ontario, from a museum, military museum there. And this is neat. Achtung is always German, right? You know that one, right? So this is Luftwaffen Maschinenschlüssel. So Air Force machine key. What I want to draw attention to is the first thing here. You have the letters 31 to 1. What do you think this corresponds to? Days of the month, that's right. And then you have here the Walzenlage. That's the 3 rotors that you have to choose, you see? And then, you know, the ring setting and you know, the plug board connections and all the rest of it. This is something I want to talk about. In any event, why do you think that the letter 1 is at the bottom and the letter 31 is at the top? So you can cut it off and throw it away, right? Makes sense? Or burn it. So you use the first day of the month, you cut that off and throw it away. Or destroy it, of course. Let's move over to Turing and the code breakers. So now, what's the point of Bletchley Park? What do they have to do? So what was key was that the Enigma machine was essentially known. In a sense that at any given moment in time, mostly the British Navy managed to capture, and Dave will follow up on this in his talk, capturing machines, codebooks, etc., until the Germans progressed the technology, if you like. And then Bletchley Park was in trouble until the Navy got more codebooks, etc., etc. Okay. So when that was done, you knew the machine, essentially. You knew the actual setup and the functionality of the machine. But that alone doesn't really help because there's 10 to the 26 settings, right? Or so. So really, you have to find out on any given day what central command set would be the plugboard connections, wheel order, ring settings, and then for a given message, you also have to find out the initial, in our case, ABC. Right. The good news, that's hard to do. The good news is you crack one message, you kind of did them all in some sense, right? Because everything is set except for the initial ABC business. Well, that's 26 by 26 by 26 combination. That's not too bad. That's not too bad. That's really not too bad, even then. There were a lot of people working at Bletchley Park. So it was a battle between the Germans constantly advancing the machine and Bletchley Park catching up. And the Imitation game, the movie, kind of gives you the wrong impression. Like, oh, we just did it over a pint. We're done for the war. No, not at all. You know? That's the key. Capturing this is absolutely crucial. Turing, as great as he was, and his colleagues alone, couldn't have done it. Very important to appreciate. So then luckily the Germans made these silly mistakes. They were utilized by Bletchley Park. One of the first messages cracked had the initial setting CIL, hence sillies. You get that? So, what were they? So, since the current, the way it flows, it cannot flow back to the same letter. It's only a single wire. A couldn't be mapped to A, right? The letter couldn't be mapped to the same letter. Well, you think, and that's what the Germans thought, I still have 25 letters left. I only take 1 out of 26 out of the equation, right? What's that? That's like 4%. I still have 96% to choose from. That's not the case. Because when you have a longer message, a cipher text, you knew that every single letter in there cannot be the original letter. And you can find correlations amongst all that, as you learn later on today. The double enciphering you just learned with the demonstration, whatever these 6 letters were, Z, K, Q, K, S, R, M in our case, whatever it is, the first one encrypted is the same one as the fourth, right? Second is the fifth, and so on. And that was exploited. Then we have these repetitive message settings. So the Germans used the QWERTY keyboard, just like today. It's, by the way, not the fastest keyboard to type on, but we all do it. Okay. So they taught it the Germans. And if you have to find 3 letters, let's say, for the initial setting, often they looked at the keyboard, oh, let's take 3 letters on a keyboard in a row or diagonally or something. They did this a lot. They used, apparently, the sentence, Maria ist mein Liebling. Maria is my darling, and chose 3 or 4 letters out of that whole sentence consecutively to be the initial setting. Believe it or not, you get lazy after doing this many, many times. Then the other thing, of course, that happened was, even if you do this really well and it couldn't be cracked, you then often you received the message and you send it on in less secure networks that could be cracked. Like in Norway, that happened, for instance. And then the Germans were often sending weather reports. And they would luckily always start off the same way, as we like to do in Germany. Wetterreport, whatever, Biscaya or something. Weather report, Bay of Biscay or something. I mean, always the same way, so then you knew, if you ever cracked that once, then you guessed, oh, the next day they sent something again at 9 o'clock from that station. It's probably another weather report starting off the same way. Assuming that you had the first 20 characters or so, right? That you actually knew what they meant. You had the ciphertext, and you figured you knew what those first 20 characters are. Okay? That's a huge amount of information. So, a well-known author whose answers his own Bletchley Park said code cracking was human, important to appreciate. Germans made mistakes, and Germans were lazy. It was a cocktail of German incompetence and lots of luck, and I say, the third Class Reich never knew. So that's me, right? I'm now famous. Meaning, officially, the Germans never knew that their Enigma machine was compromised. Some might have suspected, some might have even known, but in declassified documents, the official statements remained the same. This thing is secure. There are many reasons why the Germans either believed it or wanted to believe it. So it's all started in Poland, cracking the machine, cracking the code. Here's the most famous of them, Marin Rejewski. These were very young people, so those undergraduate students in the audience, that was a kind of age of the code breakers. Alan Turing at, I don't know what, 26 or something at the time, was old. essentially. Yeah? That's very important to appreciate. So it started in Poland. In 1929, a machine was sent to Poland by mistake. The customs opened it. It's like, oopsie. And then, send it back. Germans didn't know they would open it, so on. There were some commercial machines available, and so on and so forth. And there was Hans Thilo Schmidt, a German spy. They call him the Enigma spy. Kind of a person in personal hardship, and he sold information to the French Secret Service about the Enigma machine at the time. That was, in part, then forwarded to the Poles. Because the Brits and the French could not break the machine at the time. That was before the war, remember? The Poles then managed to break the machine that we just simulated, essentially, for many years. And they were the only people in Europe who could do it. That was before the war. Okay? And how they did it is somewhat ingenious. And ultimately, they built a device called the Bomber, on which the Bombi in Bletchley Park that Alan Turing built is somewhat based on. It's not the same, though. But it's essentially a bunch of enigmas wired together. So what you do is to break the code that is made by a machine, you build essentially the replica of the machine, and you use it then to actually break the code, okay, without knowing actually what the original text was. It's interesting. Rajewski figured out a method how to work out what the internal wiring is. That is one of the biggest intellectual achievements in the war, arguably. And then in 1939, the Germans started using more plugboard connections. Eventually, for the Navy, they introduced this other method called bigram tables and so on. The Poles eventually fell behind, couldn't break it anymore. But for 6.5 years, they could. And remember also that Germany invaded Poland in 1939. Long story short, so the knowledge was then brought over to France. The Germans invaded France, and it finally ended up in Britain, with all the knowledge that these people already, all the progress they already made. So Bletchley Park, essentially, which is in Buckinghamshire, was acquired in 1938 by, well, nowadays MI6, I guess. In those days, it was called SIS. It was part of the government code and cipher school, which these days you may refer to GCHQ, but Dave O'Keefe can speak to that if you want to. The secrets were only revealed decades later, as most of us know, and most recruits, yes, were from Cambridge, but not only mathematicians. There could be historians, you name it. Very interesting. And in January 1940, the first wartime Enigma messages were deciphered by Bletchley Park. And as of April 1940, that was the real breakthrough. They could break the naval Enigma. And it was decisive because, remember, the Americans were not in the war yet. And at some point, it was the Canadian Navy that supplied the protection of convoys towards Britain. Keep that in mind. So being able to know where the U-boats are in the Atlantic was crucial to Canadians and not being sunk, of course, right? And I met a gentleman who said this exactly about his grandfather. His grandfather said always to him before he passed away, it was funny. In the spring of 1940, all of a sudden, we got these guys through. He never knew why. He passed away without. And then I told this gentleman that in my talk, and he's very delighted, of course, to hear that. So there's Alan Turing. He died young, and many people in the audience would probably agree that he's the co-inventor, co-founder of the modern computer, artificial intelligence, and computing science. He defined those fields or progressed those fields more than maybe most people. He was very young when he became a fellow at King's College. I think he was the youngest person ever. I think Newton was 26, but don't quote me. So he asked himself, can machines think? And then he wrote this 1950 paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. You don't see that so well there in red. That's the book. But inside is this paper, Alan Turing, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Section 1, or Chapter 1, The Imitation Game. That is the name of the movie. The thought was to sort of define when a machine has intelligence. Essentially, if you communicate through a terminal with another entity for as long as you want, ask any questions you want, just communicate, and after several hours, let's say, you think, it's probably a human being at the other end, and it's a machine instead, you may call this machine intelligence. Right? So he had this great attitude. He said no one was doing anything about this Enigma problem, and certainly not the naval Enigma, at the level that they had to, so he could have that problem sort of to himself. Okay. So cracking the code now was more difficult than ever because they used bigram tables. And then he built this Bombi in 1940. There it is. And they started to crack the code of the naval Enigma. But Turing alone wouldn't have been able to do that. Some colleagues of his made major breakthroughs. So Turing's initial machine, or the way things were going, it took longer and longer sometimes to break a code, to break a single message. And there had to be some breakthroughs because there's no point in finding out weeks later what the message is. So daily would be good, right? Maybe within minutes or hours would be really helpful. And some colleagues of his, they then devised schemes how to do that more efficiently. It's sort of almost parallel computing in a way. I mean, between Turing and his colleagues, they figured out we can figure this out much faster. So he stopped working in 1943, and then the Americans take over with a lot of bombies of these machines. The Americans built lots of them. They had more computational power. They were also not under the threat of being invaded, right? So here's the bomb if you open this up. When you open this up, again, it's essentially a bunch of Enigma machines wired together, if you like. And what it really does is it rules things out. Okay, so in a way, it sort of works the following. You have a ciphertext, and you think you know part of it, what it actually means. Say, weather station Hamburg or something. Okay, you figure you know that, but you get the actual ciphertext. Then the question is, what setting of the machine, when you punch in, weather station Hamburg, gets you that part of the ciphertext? Does that make sense? And you assume something. And then you sort of crank through it, the assumption, with a big machine like this, many times per second. And no, that leads to a contradiction. This doesn't work. We throw this away. We throw this setting away. And you throw many settings away, if that makes sense. Then you're left with a few, and you could check those manually. That's really what happened. So what you need is what's called a crib. Some part of the ciphertext that you have confidence of, that you knew actually what it meant. Those were critical. So you could sort of check all the read settings with them, say 10 hours or so. I mean, it varied, right? Okay, but sort of order of magnitude. Towards the Americans, did it pretty fast, actually. Minutes, sort of, towards the end. Crossword talent was a huge advantage because the same mindset, right? If I assume this and that, do I get all the way to the end, or is there a contradiction along the way? Chess is a bit similar that way. Okay, and then, like I already said, you can do the rest manually. So again, absolutely critical to have what's called a crib. And since the Germans always advanced the machine, you constantly had to capture documents, code books, machines, etc. So this had a huge impact on the war, and two examples which had a huge influence in that regard is what happened in Norway and what happened in Dieppe, and this will be mentioned in a few minutes. So my last little piece here is on Canada's connection, and we're at Waterloo, so lots of you, I'm sure, know about William Tutt, and some of you probably know much more than I do about William Tutt. But there were other codes in the war, of course. So you had different militaries, different nations, different militaries using different machines and different ways to encrypt text. So by the way, the Germans also listened to the Brits for a long time, successfully. And the amazing part is that they never found anything in that pointed to the Enigma code being compromised. It is a miracle almost, but David can speak to that a little bit better than I can. You know about Native American code talkers probably, and there are many examples, and so keep that in mind. Enigma was an example. The Japanese used an Enigma, at least in part, and so it was important to break this thing. Maybe the most important, if you're an ally anyways, right, obviously. Here is our own Canadian, born in Britain, code breaker, William Tutt. There he is. His first degree was in chemistry, and he became a famous mathematician, I would say, to me, he is. Worked on graph theory and other things. What he did was, so Hitler didn't, I don't know if he didn't trust the Enigma, but there was so much used, of course, that he thought, well, I should really have a machine that is even more secure. And so they built this Lawrence cipher machine. There it is. It has 12 wheels. You sort of count them here. And they're also unique wheels. No wheel is like another wheel. And this was used to encrypt messages, right? But the Allies never got their hands onto these machines. So all they got were the signals. And so then the challenge was, by just getting signals without ever having seen the device that does the trick, how do you figure out what the device is? And with the help of others, but Tut was the main person, he figured it out. And in fact, he figured this out from just a handful of messages. He sort of reverse engineered the machine with colleagues. And then they built a big computer to do this on an ongoing basis. So he developed a methodology to figure out what the original text was. Okay, that's a huge achievement. This computer was called the Colossus. Many people say this was the first electronic computer ever built. Others disagree, but give or take, it's around that time anyways. It's a phenomenal machine you can still see at Bletchley Park. He moved then after the war to the University of Toronto, as many of you know, and then afterwards the University of Waterloo seemed to be as a co-founder of this very institution, certainly for some of the things that Waterloo is definitely known for. Should be very proud of him. And he got the Order of Canada in 2002. Legacy. Well, he left a huge legacy. To me, it seems there's this big connection from Bletchley Park all the way to Blackberry and encryption technology, right? And it's a fantastic story, I think. Some of you might have been personally touched by William Tut, I'm sure. And with that, I then want to close, and there are other things we'd like to address. Camp X in Whitby, Ontario, and for things like James Bond and Battle of Dieppe, and other ways to capture Enigma machines and code books, Berg is handing over to O'Keefe. Yeah, all right.
Well, thank you, Peter. That was wonderful. I think what I want to do is take you guys back in time. Let's go to the period 1942, 40 to 42. Let's paint some context here. By the beginning of 1942, Nazi Germany was at its apex. It had troops all the way in the northern part of Norway, in North Africa, the gates of Moscow, and all the way to the western part of Europe in the English Channel. This, from 40 to 42, was probably, I would argue, the most dangerous period in the history of Western civilization, and particularly in the modern era. It was also, for the British, their darkest moment. And one of the ways that they needed to keep alive at this time, and they were hanging on by their fingernails, there was no doubt about that in 1940, was to maintain the flow of merchant vessels and supplies coming into England. Think about shipping at this time like the circulatory system of the body. You cut off the blood, the organs die. That is a very simple way of taking a look at the situation with the British at this time. Primordial to this was information. Trying to crack the Enigma code that Peter so eloquently discussed, and you can see how difficult that was to start with. To be able to get the information that would be able to pinpoint, or at least give you a very close approximation to where the German U-boats were lurking along these various shipping lanes. With this information, you could then reroute convoys out of harm's way, or ideally, send out hunter-killer forces to go after the submarines. Now, of course, you have to remember there's a battle of technology not only when it comes to cryptography, but also in the war at sea. The U-boats have the upper hand at this time. Anti-submarine warfare has not developed to the point where it would later in the war. Other types of signals intelligence, traffic analysis, radio fingerprinting, direction finding, are in their infancy. More importantly, the interface between what is going on at Bletchley Park and the consumers, the admirals, the decision makers, Churchill himself. They don't want inference. They want solid evidence to base their decisions on. It was very difficult to get those people to understand the culture of what Peter has just delivered. And so as a result, you wanted definite information about where the U-boats were, and the only thing that would deliver that was cracking the Enigma and getting that information at that time. Later in the war, things would change. The other types of signals intelligence would come into their own, and it was a healthy balance and mixture, but not at this time. And the amount of resources that eventually went into this, but more importantly, as I will argue here, sadly, the amount of blood that also went into this. We tend to forget in the beauty of this intellectual endeavor, there were also thousands of men who were killed just attempting to get that information for guys like Alan Turing and for, well, not so much Tut, but for Peter Twin and the other codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Think about it in gaming terms. And I hate to use that, but let's try to make this a bit more relevant. Many of you will seek out cheats. Let's face it, don't deny it. I have kids, I know this, okay? In other words, instead of waiting to get to the end of the game, you're going to find any cheat code you can to try to jump to the end because you don't have the patience. Well, consider yourself like Churchill and the chiefs of staff and the admirals. This is a world at war. They don't have the time. Without a doubt, genius is going to kick in, but it may kick in too late. So as a result, you have to accelerate genius. And to do that, that means mounting operations of various sizes, various scales, various types, to get the information that you need to allow the code breakers to indeed become geniuses. And this is where I want to take you tonight. What we really didn't know, and something I didn't know when I started my research into Dieppe, was just how systematic this approach to capturing material really was. In the historiography, we always hear that these are just ad hoc operations, that they were thrown on out of desperation. And indeed, they were when they started in 1940. But as 1940 turned into 41 and 42, they became much more systematic. And they were done in fascinating ways, or at least they started off in fascinating ways. The first one, as you can see at the top, was appropriately named Operation Ruthless. Why? Well, its author decided that the best way of attempting to capture the material was to dress up a small British commando unit like a Luftwaffe bomber crew, use a captured German bomber in the middle of the Battle of Britain, and they were going to basically attach themselves to a bomber stream heading back from the Blitz on London. They were going to fly out over the English Channel, start sending out signals to various German ships to come and rescue them as if they had a problem on board. They were going to dive down and actually, believe it or not, light the plane up with smoke to basically simulate that they were in distress. They were going to ditch in the English Channel and draw out a German rescue boat with the material on board that they needed. They were basically pulling off a Trojan horse play. So basically what they were going to do was they were going to jump into their life rafts, they were going to paddle over, and then as the German craft came over, a British plane would appear suddenly out of nowhere and come in and dive into the scene, drawing the attention of the surface craft crew. And while that was happening, the plane would come in, move off, drop its bombs as if it missed, and in that period, the commandos would spring the Trojan horse play, jump on board, grab whatever it was, the Enigma machine, the codes, the cipher books, anything else that they needed. And here's the best part: murder the crew to cover it up. Because one of the keys with the pinch operations was never allowing the Germans to know that you got your hands on the material that could compromise their system. Now, the author of this operation was none other than Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond. Now, of course, when I first saw that, I kind of shook my head and said, no, no, there's no way. This has to be a flight of Fleming fancy, as we would call it, and most historians believe the same thing. Until I started digging deeper and realized when I came across the orders for this, Operation Ruthless happened. It went in twice. It came up empty both times. But they attempted it. Think about that. They cleared airspace in the middle of the Battle of Britain to do this on 2 occasions. The second time they went out, they realized, although we are playing for keeps, we may want to pull back on the murdering of the crew, and let's use tear gas this time. Let's see if we can subdue them, and then we'll keep them in seclusion when we capture them and bring them in. So they pulled back from the idea of a war crime. That was nice. That was nice. So anyway, out of that, when they failed, they decided they were going to change their methodology. one of the big problems was trying to drag ships, German ships, across the channel. One of the terminuses that they found that had the material that they needed was Dieppe. And that was right at the beginning. They were tracking a ship called the Bernard von Cherski, which was an aircraft tender. And they loved this as a target because not only did it have the naval Enigma, it also had the Air Force Enigma on board. So it was one-stop shopping. That will be a theme here, okay? It was one-stop shopping. So they were trying to bait the Bernard von Cherski or other ships like this out, and they failed. So what they decided to do then was to go after ships that were in ports. And this is when they decided that they were going to come up with combined operation raids on ports, because that way you had the ships that you wanted hemmed in. They couldn't take off, they couldn't run away. More importantly, there was something else that was a bonus in a port: naval headquarters. You had a naval shore headquarters, which early in the war were on the coast. Later on, after the St. Nazaire raid, they moved them back for safety. But this was also considered to be, if you will, the pot of gold. If you could get what was in the harbor on the ships, you would likely get the key sheets that Peter showed. You would get them for the current month and maybe for the next month. But if you got in a naval headquarters or a naval communications supply depot, you could get stacks waiting to be distributed for months on end down the line. Imagine that if you can get your hands on those. Well, this is what they did. In the spring of 1941, they went after Lofoten in Operation Claymore up in Norway. And they went after trawlers, small German trawlers, which contained the Enigma and the code books that they needed. Now, of course, the Germans didn't really pick up on this. Why would anybody go after a trawler? What does it mean? There's nothing really there. And also, too, they're raiding the island. So as a result, it melts into the entire operation, which is exactly what they were looking for. Well, sure enough, they had great success. The first big break comes in 1941. And after that, they are able to systematically break the three-rotor version of the German Enigma. This directly leads to the sinking of the Bismarck and a change in the fortunes in the submarine war. Submarine sinkings up to this time were through the roof. As soon as they were able to break in, they drop off dramatically. Now, the other thing was, because this was so successful, but combined operations was still growing, they didn't have a lot of shipping to continue to pull off operations like this. So they went back to their original method of trying to draw out ships. But this time, instead of sending out aircraft to do it, they sent out small naval forces. And part of the way to cover this up was to use overcompensation, what they would call using a steam hammer to crack a nut. So in other words, if your target was a small weather trawler in the middle of nowhere, you don't send one craft after it, because then they'll wonder exactly what you're doing. You send 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers. So in other words, nobody in their right mind would ever believe that that kind of force allocation would be laid on specifically for that kind of craft. So in other words, if the craft disappeared, well, it was incidental. They just ran into it. Well, this was also highly successful. They continued to pinch and pinch material and more material, and I would argue the British got drunk with success. And that's when things started to change. Although with the German hierarchy, most of them did not believe that the Enigma had been compromised, except for Donitz, the head of the U-boat arm. Although he didn't have the proof, he suspected it. And what they already had, and they were stockpiling, were the new 4-rotor machines. So he instituted a change. He ordered it in the fall of 1941, and it took effect in the spring, or basically the winter of 1942. But for the Nazi hierarchy, and this is the difference between the Germans, or the Nazis at this time, and the British, you have Churchill, who is open to intellectual endeavors. For all his strengths and weaknesses, he could absorb this and understand it. As a matter of fact, in World War I, he had his fingers wrapped around cryptography. When the German codes were captured by the Russians off the Berg, he was the one in England standing there receiving them when they came in. So he understood what this meant. You didn't have the same thing in the Nazi hierarchy. You had incredible cryptographers, great success. But one of the reasons why the Germans continued to have such faith in the Enigma was because nobody at the higher level of the Nazi regime could actually fathom or understand this. So as a result, you can argue that you have the war being won at this time by the intellectual over the anti-intellectual. And this is where we're moving. Well, after they start to sort of get drunk on their success, they realize, oh my God, things are starting to change. There's something wrong now. The Germans are introducing new keys for their U-boats, but thank God it's still on the three-rotor, but there's something in the wind. Well, the world changes in December 1941. The United States of America is attacked by Japan. The US comes in. Churchill is doing cartwheels. We're going to win the war now. We're going to win the war. We have the United States of America on our side. We have the mass of American might, industrial capability, natural resources on our side. But you can't exploit it unless you secure the shipping lanes. And so as a result, they put on another raid, hoping that not only could they get more material to continue to break into the three-rotor, but if they were really lucky, going up to Norway, they might be able to find something to do with the four-rotor, which they knew existed, and they knew the machines were starting to be distributed to not only U-boats, but surface vessels. So think about the power they have in their hands. It would be like you sitting in a poker game, knowing what your opponent is holding all the time. All 5 cards in a poker game. Now suddenly, 4 cards, 3 cards, 2 cards, and then 0. Blackout. Well, you can imagine again the British, even though in theory they think we've won the war, they have to get through 1942. It doesn't matter how many soldiers the United States has, the resources, the tanks, other types of weapons. If they can't physically move them off the shores of the United States to bring them over to England or to bring them to North Africa or to Western Europe, the war will not be won. It is a war of distribution. There's no doubt about it. And so as a result, they try again. They have the most successful pinch raid, for the most part, in Norway again. They go back, and they go back to raids yet again. They're successful. It's wonderful. But they come up short. Nothing to do with the four-rotor. They're crossing their fingers that the Germans do not introduce the four-rotor. Probably one of the greatest mistakes they've ever made. Within a week of basically saying, okay, we're going to hold our breath, and we're not going to do anything to basically get the Germans to suspect any more that we have compromised the three-rotor and therefore moved to the four-rotor, we're going to keep our fingers crossed. Within a week of doing that, the Germans introduced the four-rotor. But this time only, thankfully for the moment, only to the U-boats in the Atlantic, which was bad enough, without a doubt. By early March, Bletchley Park and the Royal Navy had evidence in hand that surface vessels now in the English Channel that frequented Dieppe and other areas had also now been issued with the four-rotor. Even though they weren't using it, the writing was on the wall. This is considered to be a nightmare scenario for not only the cryptographers, but for the Royal Navy. And very soon after that, when they get the confirmation, they start planning for the Dieppe raid. Why Dieppe? Well, let's take a look. Oh, I should go back. One of the things that sold me when I was doing my research, which took about 15 years to do, because I had found a document years ago that suggested that this could be the prime mover and shaker for the entire Dieppe operation. It took me 15 years to test that hypothesis. And one of the last things that solidified my research and solidified my conclusions was the release of material by GCHQ in 2013 that indeed indicated that there was a pinch doctrine, what I'm talking to you about today, that this was not ad hoc, this was not, just done something off the cuff, but there was actually a developing playbook, if you will, for doing something like this, to basically make sure that the code breakers at Bletchley had what they needed, and basically that the beast that Bletchley Park had become now could continually be fed. So in this particular case, you had 3 different types of pinch operations. A pinch by chance, basically in the middle of a normal operation, you stumble across something. This looks fantastic, pick it up, make sure it gets back to Bletchley, it's important. Pinch by opportunity. Oh, by the way, we're putting on a raid, and we may come into contact with a naval headquarters or trawler, so be ready to get the information, no problem. And then, when truly desperate, pinch by design. We need to solve this issue now, build up an operation, and put it on to get the material. So for me, the question was, what was Dieppe? Was it pinch by opportunity, pinch by design? We know it wasn't pinch by chance. So it came down to this, and that was the argument. By the way, I want to show you a little something on a sidebar. It may be hard to see up there. This is a picture from an American report at the end of the war. An arm of a dead body, it looks like a bayonet, and a scorched series of code books. These were their teaching tools. This was part of the manual that they were using to teach the Americans how to pull off pinch operations. By the way, that's the reason why the Americans were at Dieppe in the first place. They were there to learn. Part of this had to do with another issue that was going on behind the scenes, the race to monopolize cryptographic technology. In 1942, this essentially, I would argue, is one of the last natural resources that the British have to stand toe-to-toe with anybody else in the world. They'd been selling off assets. They'd been trading bases for destroyers. Now they have something that's important. And when I sat down with the legendary Sir Harry Hinsley, who was all over Bletchley Park at this time and responsible for negotiations and for the agreement later on in the war that the Americans and the British had, he told me very simple, this is the way it worked. We staked out our claim to cryptography in the West. The Americans could have it against the Japanese. We agreed that we would provide the Americans with everything that we had when it came to the product. In other words, the information that we were decoding. We would give it to them. The idea was, and this is how he explained it to me, it's like an oil field. It's our oil field, our refinery, our pipeline. We will build a pipeline to the United States, open up the taps and give them everything. But under no circumstances do we allow them to find the oil, drill the oil, or establish their own refineries and distribution and move us out of the way. So that was the agreement that was in place in 1941 and 42 when the war started. But when they switched from 3-rotor to 4-rotor and could no longer find U-boats and suddenly all the sinkings went up, guess whose ships were being sunk? The Americans. So the Americans then said, look, what is happening? You have promised us gold, intelligence gold. You're not providing it. If you don't provide it, we are going to do it ourselves. So there was an increased pressure on the British to maintain their current lead or monopoly, depending on how you want to term it, at that particular time. And so again, the reason why they were very desperate at this point to continue on. All right. Now, when you know anything about pinch doctrine, and this is the key, it's predicated on surprise, almost to the level of being ludicrous. Now, obviously, when you're putting on a military operation, you obviously want an element of surprise. It always helps if you can surprise your enemy. But there's also tactical reality. In other words, you can only go so far with surprise before you actually have to deal with your enemy. The problem with these pinch operations was the ones that started at the beginning were so successful. It was success after success after success. And guess what happened? They never thought by the time they got to something like Dieppe that it could ever go wrong. Everything had been falsely reinforced by success. And so as a result, they weren't drawing the proper lessons. They were getting bigger, they were getting greedier. You had a character like Lord Louis Mountbatten who takes over combined operations. And by the way, most of you probably don't know Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was considered to be a rather fluffy royal figure, and he may have been, also understood cryptography, and he was the one who designed the signals scheme for the entire Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. He understood this. And by the way, so did Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond, who was the assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence, had his fingers in every part of the intelligence pie. He was dealing with MI6. He was dealing with GCHQ. He was at Bletchley Park all the time. He was also a student of cryptography, which we never knew before. Yes, for those of you who may know something about Fleming, when he passed away, he had one of the greatest collections the world has ever seen of first edition science and technology books. This was his passion. He was a technocrat, loved it. Guess what his #1 book was, or his #1 author? For those of you who understand computer science, you will gasp when you hear this name. Charles Babbage, the father of the computer. Ian Fleming was not a lightweight. He was not James Bond. He didn't go off into action, but he knew what he was up to. And so did Mountbatten, and so did everybody else involved with the Dieppe Raid, who were all intelligence or signals intelligence in World War I and World War II. Their fingerprints are all over this. Well, this is how they would do it. The idea was surprise. Get on your enemy very quickly. Don't give them a chance to breathe, let alone destroy the documents and the machinery that you came to get. The firepower did not have to be destructive. You didn't want to completely destroy what you were coming after, right? You basically had to pin your enemy, get close, kill him, grab the stuff, get out. The other thing, too, was that you had to get a route to get out. You couldn't just storm in, hope that everything went, according to plan, and walk away. You had to be able to create a pipeline to extract the information out, even while the battle was raging. And this is exactly what they were doing in Norway and later on in Dieppe. Also, too, at the end of it, you had to cover your tracks. So wherever you went in to pilfer the information from, or the material from, you blew up. And as a matter of fact, had Dieppe actually worked, had the British and the Canadians reached their targets, Dieppe itself, if any of you have ever visited it now, would not be the same. The destruction plan for Dieppe was immense. Not only the entire harbor was going to be leveled, but as a nice little public relations gesture, they were going to detonate about 2,500 German torpedoes, which were stored in the cliffs. So basically, had they done that while they were in the middle of the channel, you probably would have had shattered windows in London because of that kind of explosion. An explosion like that probably would have matched something like Halifax in 1917. So Dieppe, as we know it, would not be the same. So think about that. Also, too, the bottom. Heavy casualties, and there's one thing I forgot to put up there, justification for mounting these operations and incurring heavy casualties, even to the last man, were considered to be okay if you were going after what was considered to be A1 targets. What were A1 targets? Naval Enigma. Right there in black and white. You can see the urgency. 3 forwarder versions, cipher tables, setting machines, anything and everything that Peter just told you about, basically all the ingredients for the cake. Then you have what is called the RHV code book. That is a reserve code book that they used to do. What a lot of you probably don't know is the Enigma used to break down quite a bit. And as a result, you were stuck. So you'd have to rely on the reserve code book that you kept for emergencies. Well, minor ships also use this. So if you could capture that, you would be able to get the cribs that Peter was talking about to then use in the decryption process. So with that, you also had E-bars, B-bars, weather codes. E-bars and B-bars were used for aircraft liaison with U-boats, so anything along those lines. So it's not just about getting the Enigma. It's about finding anything that is associated with Enigma on a sliding scale to be able to crack it in some way. If you got gold with A1, fantastic. But if you didn't, and you were able to get A2, A3, or the German Navy's general cipher, or even the dockyard cipher, which they listed at B1, you then could use it to be able to provide the cribs that people like Turing, etc., needed. Now, the one thing that also, actually this spurred me on, was when I found, I guess this was 23 years ago, I found a document that had just been declassified. It was ultra secret. It was all about a commando unit that was created specifically for the Dieppe operation to grab the material that we were talking about. It was created by, of course, Ian Fleming. And the idea was to get behind enemy lines in an attack and grab the information that we need and get it out securely. Before this, they were actually using people who had been at Bletchley Park. They were attaching them to the pinch operations and sending them in. And then they suddenly realized this probably isn't a good idea from a security perspective if these guys get captured. So the idea was to create a unit that sort of knew what it was going after, but didn't understand the full context of how it was going to be used, if indeed they were captured. But the key was, and this is one of their documents that came out, it was a brief history about this unit. And in it, it said no raid should be laid on for SIGINT, which is signals intelligence purposes only. The scope of the objectives should always be sufficiently wide to presuppose normal operational objectives. So in other words, they had learnt in 1941 by pinching off the individual trawlers that the Germans were going to catch on. So the idea was to go back and widen the operations to then tuck in the pinch to make it just seamlessly blend in with everything else. Now, not only did that work against the Germans, it worked against us historians for so many years too. Because, of course, this was not discussed. We didn't know until 1995 when this was released that anything to do with Ultra was even attached to the Dieppe Raid. And of course, it took me another 15 years to put all the pieces together because it took that long for GCHQ to start a pragmatic, or a protracted, I should say, release of material. So for instance, it was kind of, as a historian, it was kind of like having a jigsaw puzzle in front of me and having a box lid and only getting a couple of pieces every once in a while. And eventually, it all started to come together. Well, at the end of the day, sadly, and I've already discussed that. Oh, by the way, the other thing too was the cooperation of the press. Although the press didn't know what was going on, the press was more than eager for good stories. So they always had a press line ready. Whether it be victory, defeat, stalemate, it didn't matter. They always had the narrative ready to be fed to the press to make sure that they covered up. So for instance, if they captured a ship, it was reported as sunk. So anything along that, and the press played along, but they didn't really understand what it was. Well, in Dieppe, these were some of the targets. These were the ships that you would have normally in Dieppe Harbor. Some of them would use the Enigma on a regular basis. Others would use the lower codes that I showed you as well. You can see this. This is actually from a German newsreel that was shot the day after. And you can see the craft that are in the harbor. These, without a doubt, had the Enigma. And in March, there was confirmation that these ships, not specifically these ones, but ones like this, had been outfitted with the brand new 4-rotor machine. So from an intelligence perspective, a pinch perspective, Dieppe looked like it was one-stop shopping. As a matter of fact, as Frank Birch, who ran naval section at Bletchley, said, it's the whole bag of tricks. And indeed, that's what it looked like. It looked like the whole bag of tricks. Now, as most of you know, Dieppe turned in to an incredible disaster. I'm not going to get into the planning of it, but 6 hours, 1,000 Canadian, British, and American troops are killed in 6 hours of fighting on August 19th, 1942. The Canadians and the British get within a hair's breadth of getting what they came for, but they're overwhelmed. They get close, but they don't come away with it. It is, I guess you could argue, one of the greatest risks ever taken, but perhaps you would come away with one of the greatest rewards if it was successful. Now, as you can see, it's changed the way we look at Dieppe over the years. We never understood this before. We never understood this as an engine. It has completely changed the way we look at it. But to get back to what I said when I started this, these weren't the only casualties for pinch operations. You lost men in the Lofoten Island raids. You lost men on the other pinch operations. Pinch operations didn't stop with Dieppe. As a matter of fact, the unit, 30th Assault Unit, that you see here, a bunch of kids between 17 and 21 years old, full, as they used to say, of piss and vinegar. They just want to get in there and get at the enemy. Well, this unit and a lot of other men ended up paying the ultimate price as the war went on. Because, like I said, pinching didn't stop. They fought right to the end of the war, and eventually that turned into what we call TICOM teams, Target Committee teams, that were sent all over Germany at the end of the war to grab whatever they could about communications and signals intelligence, because not only were they interested in what the Germans were doing when it came to encryption, but they were interested in what the Germans were doing when it came to decryption as well. In other words, what did the Germans know and when did they know it? And so out of this, you end up getting an incredible legacy. The 30th Assault Unit, as you see here, is still around today. As a matter of fact, it's just been reconstituted in the last few years based on their exploits in World War II. So as you can see here, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers right now, the idea that there's much more of a human story that is attached to the incredible intellectual endeavors that went on at Bletchley Park. Something that I think we should never forget. Thank you. Oh, need some water.
Well, as I let you sort of pause and think about some of your questions and also let our speakers grab a bit of water, just want to remind you about the couple of the upcoming lectures that are coming up here at St. Jerome's in the next coming months. On Friday, March 2nd at 4:30, St. Jerome's is offering its reading series. That's with cutting-edge Canadian writers, and in this case, it's a presentation by Liz Howard. On Friday, April 13th at 7:30 p.m., the Lectures in Catholic Experience welcomes Sister Helen Prigent to present on Dead Men Walking, The Journey Continues. Also taking place in April, a lecture in the Medieval Studies lecture series by Lise Roy from the University of Quebec at Montreal, Royal Entries in 16th Century France. Watch for details on that on the St. Jerome's website. So we have about 15 minutes here for questions. After that, both our speakers are more than happy to talk to you, but I'll ask you to join them outside in the lobby, and I'll be directing us out there afterwards. So we got about 15 minutes worth of questions, and I'll try and moderate from here. So we've also got speakers, our volunteers here. Please, if I acknowledge you, one of them will bring you a mic. You can ask your questions to the mic, and that way we get it captured for the video record. So happy to answer any questions. One there at the back. Second last row.
Thanks. It kind of left me hanging there. The Americans were mad that their shipping was being sunk. The four rotors were being distributed. Obviously, they were being put in use. And Raid and Dieppe didn't get the results that they wanted. So
What happened?
what happened?
Well, as a matter of fact, something that they couldn't count on, which was chance. There was a sinking of a German U-boat in October, just off in the Middle East, or just off in the Mediterranean off the Middle East. And they were able to capture one of the machines and the code books. And out of that, they were able to start to tap into the four-rotor. Now, the other thing that was happening, I should have probably told you this, is that they were developing the four-rotor version of the bombs that they were using to help decrypt the three-rotor. One of the big problems was you could try to use three rotors on a three-rotor bomb on a four-rotor problem, but it would take something like 38 days to have a hope in hell of breaking one. So it really wasn't efficient. So what they were doing in the interim was rushing through the production of the four-rotor bombs, which the Americans were the ones who took the lead on, because they weren't going to wait for the British anymore to do this. So what happens was, when they ended up pinching some material by chance in the fall of 1942, it then started to open the door slowly, if you will, to full exploitation by summer of 1943.
Other questions? Right here, second row, please.
Hi. So since there was so many secrets about the cryptographic methods being kept from the Americans, I believe that there was some communication between Turing and Shannon later. Can you comment on how
Well,
that might have
yeah, thank
been
you. I mean,
related?
basically, the cat is out of the bag after the problems with the four-rotor. The British realized they cannot provide what they said they were going to provide, so they decided to bring the Americans in on the problem within the naval aspect. They were worried that if they didn't provide anything or let them in, that the Americans would push them out completely, not just on the naval question, but on all questions. So it was kind of like lesser of two evils. In other words, we better let them in. So that's one of the reasons why you see cooperation increase as the war goes on. It was just inevitability. The British actually realized, look, you know, the Americans are steaming ahead on this. So it's better that we are partners. If not, they're just going to cut us out.
Right over here.
Seems to me there was an emphasis on naval attacks to try and get the machines one off by trawlers, whatever. In your talk, you mentioned there was an abundance of information at the naval squadron housing or office in the harbors. 60, 90 days worth of code sheets or whatever, which seems like a gold mine compared to one machine plus machines in stock or whatever. Do you know of any underground operations on land to attack those naval bases or naval squadron offices?
No, I don't, and I think there's a good reason for it. They didn't trust the French. Very simple. You have to remember that the British were very proprietary when it came to this. One of the reasons why I think even there was a question about the Canadians going on the raid in the first place was because they were not British. Mountbatten wanted the entire operation to be carried out by the Royal Marine Division. And when he did not get that, he carved the pinch core of this operation out of the Royal Marines, created the Royal Marine Commando out of this, and then brought the Canadians in, if you will, kind of like the helmet and shoulder pads of a football player. In other words, to be able to provide the protection for these guys to get to their target. And then we find out later that the Canadians actually played a role, or were supposed to play a role, in the pinch. When the Canadians stormed over Main Beach, if you've ever been to Dieppe and you know it, they were supposed to push right through with the tanks, with the engineers and the infantry into the harbor, and they were supposed to seize the area, or basically pacify the area to allow the British commandos to come in. Now, of course, if they didn't reach the target, it didn't matter. The British commandos were going in, come hell or high water. And so they were willing to take heavy casualties to be able to come away with this. I don't think they expected to take as many as they did at Dieppe. They expected it to be a bit more of a cakewalk than it really was. But yes, Dieppe, as I found out, Dieppe and Bayonne, two of the areas that were selected for pinch operations in that period, were the only supply centers for naval communications at that time. And the only place on the channel was Dieppe, the only place on the west coast was Bayonne. Both were targets for obvious reasons.
So if I can just add one thing. So the Brits managed to capture Enigma documents and material and machines of U-boats also, right? That's in the Atlantic, for instance, right? So by the way, U-boats, German U stands for undersea, underwater, Unterwasserboot. Okay, underwater boat. They could only remain below the surface for so long because the battery would eventually run out of power. So at some point you have to service with your U-boat. So they managed to do that. And then if crew members were captured, they would then often be brought to North America for the remaining part of the war and kept in isolation so they couldn't communicate back to Germany that they were captured and they got the materials and so on. So that's important to appreciate. Apparently, for those of you who've seen the German movie Das Boot, the boat, which is one of my favorites, it was apparently representing a particular crew of the U-110, so I was told, which was captured.
Over here. Right.
This is a history-related question. So the pinch operation, something like that had never been planned before in history. So what kind of material and like reference material were the planners of such operations drawing on when they were planning for those?
Great question. As far as I can see, they weren't. This was brand new, and this is part of the feeling out process. And I would argue that's one of the reasons why we end up with the disaster we do at Dieppe. Because frankly, as I said before, they're having success after success after success. So by the time they start planning Dieppe, they're extremely arrogant. They are cutting corners. There's a victory disease that has set in. And as a result, they overreach. But from what I can see, they do learn the lessons after that. And so after this, as far as I know, there are no other pinches by design. After this, they're like, wait a second, we've overreached. Let's do it simply by opportunity. We know that the invasion of North Africa is coming. We know that there's going to be operations in Italy. We know there's going to be a big operation sometime across the English Channel, the invasion of Normandy. Also, too, with the pinch by chance in the fall of 42, the urgency decreases. And as a matter of fact, it goes the opposite way. Now that we're in, we don't want to put on any more pinch raids that may inadvertently tip off the Germans. And they also have to be very careful about incidental contact as well. So it's a very, very difficult game to play. But to get back to what you were saying, as far as I can see, there was nothing, at least in this design, that they were drawing on at all. And that was one of the reasons why they were so excited to sell this to the Americans. You know, see what we can do.
Over here, one more question up here. In the blue shirt, yes.
Peter, you mentioned that quantum cryptography is inherently different in that you can know who's hearing. Could you touch a bit more on that?
Of course, you probably have a lot of people sitting around you right now who could really explain it to you, but but maybe that's a secret in itself. But in any event, so as I explained before, in case of the Enigma, but it was also the case with other encryption technologies. As you saw, you would send this by Morse code, right? In this case, for the Enigma by Morse code, and anyone can naturally, it's a radio wave, you can just listen into this Morse code, which is what was done, of course. By the way, if you did that through triangulation, right, if it's coming from a U-boat, let's say, right, through triangulation, you could maybe also identify where that U-boat is, by the way. Okay. In any event, you have the ciphertext. And if I was to communicate with David, let's say Fritz in this case, not Dave, right? Hans and Fritz.
Hans and Fritz.
Hans and Fritz. So, sorry. Anyway, so if I sent this to him, I really just sent it to everyone, right? And if, say, you listened in, I couldn't tell. So, that makes sense, right? It's for you, it's a free radio signal. And I couldn't tell. If I was to communicate with David through apparently quantum encryption, right? So I'm sending him a signal, if you like, that is strongly correlated to what I did in the first place before I sent him this. And he received a signal, and we checked certain properties of that signal. Those properties will be affected by the fact whether or not someone is in between listening to it. Listening to it means along the line, someone has to somewhat interfere with that signal or measure that signal. Do some kind of measurement along the line has to be done to that signal. That changes the correlation that otherwise would exist between me and David if there's no one in between. And we have a ways to check that, if you like. Okay, long story short. And I admire, by the way, those people. The theory is one thing. I teach quantum mechanics sometimes, at least, every now and again, every year or two. And well, no one understands it, as some physicists would say anyways, but I teach it. One of those guys who teaches it and doesn't understand. So, in any event, and then I tell the students, how dare you fail my final exam? So, but anyways, so I teach this, right? And I kind of get the quantum encryption. I'm not a researcher in quantum encryption, right? But I kind of get it. But building it, to me, man, do I ever have huge admiration for people who make that happen for real. So, some of the people on this campus, right? I find it absolutely fantastic to achieve this, because in practice, what happens between me and David, there will be some noise along the way, right? It's not a perfect connection, typically. Typically, it's not. So to actually implement this, we're sort of on the cusp now, it seems. It's fantastic. It really is.
Time for one more question. Over here, this gentleman up there.
In relation to lessons learned, what significance is there on Admiral Hall and also Churchill's memoirs after the First World War regarding the Secret War and Admiral Dönitz adopting Enigma?
Okay, great question. Do we have an hour? Without a doubt, who you were referring to is Admiral Blinker Hall, who was legendary codebreaker in World War I. He was the one who, I would argue, started the infrastructure of British signals intelligence in World War I. Although retired in World War II, he was kind of the godfather that everybody went to in World War II. So the pattern was set by him. When it came to Churchill, of course, like I mentioned in the talk, was absolutely enamored by signals intelligence and code breaking. He understood that information was power in this sense. And one of the things that Dönitz was worried about, he seemed to be the one that was ahead of the entire Nazi high command, was realizing that, of course, this was a game that was being played, a cat and mouse game, as Peter referred to earlier. In other words, one development creates another one. And so he was one of the first ones to tap into it. And when the naval Enigma was first created, it was stronger than the Army or the Air Force. And a lot of that had to do with Dönitz's influence. And then, of course, later on, he was the first one to get the jump on the four-rotor, realizing, although he couldn't prove it, he had the power or enough power to be able to implement the four-rotor. So he sensed that there was something going on and he needed increased protection. So I hope that somewhat answers your question in a short period of time. Thank you.
Now, if I could ask you to join me in thanking Peter and David for a great talk.
Nice job, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's great.
Thank you. Good job.
Now, Peter and David have agreed to meet and chat with people. They'll do so in the lobby. I'll ask you to please remain seated while they go out there. Plus, Richard has got his Enigma machine and is more than happy to let people explain to the workings and that. So that's all there. In the meantime, though, while we're waiting for everybody to get relocated, just to remind you that the final lecture in this year's Bridges Lecture Series will be is entitled Recursion, the Loops That Make the World Go Round. What are we? By what processes and patterns did we originate? And how do these patterns compare to the processes of the world around us? Digital and biological, societal and fictional. Learn more when Professors Andrew DeMann, a specialist in science fiction, Josh Neufeld, a microbiologist, and Naomi Nishimura, a computer scientist, join us for this lecture. Please, if you're interested in these, sign up for the events online at www.sju.ca/bridges. And with that, I wish everybody a pleasant evening and a safe drive. And again, thanks for coming out.